Good morning, all. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have part 2 of the series. We know not everyone was able to join us for part 1. Do not worry, we will catch you up, and information will be readily accessible throughout this event along with afterwards. Again, as you can see, we're welcoming you to part 2 of our virtual panel discussion, Who and What Counts? Recognizing BIPOC and women leaders' contribution. A few housekeeping ideas or notes of question. We're all familiar with Zoom, so as you can see, everyone's mic will be muted. We do have a chat box that you can put information in. You can certainly add your comments along with any questions you may have or any feedback you'd like to give us. Please feel free to be able to do that. Who we are, for those who are not as familiar, CWIP, nonprofit, volunteer-driven membership organization of more than 200 in the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors. As you can see, our mission and our vision are as stated. For those who are not familiar, one of our premier programs, WLMP, the Women's Leadership Mentoring Program, with 2 cohorts now has an application that is available. The deadline is October 14th. In the chat, you will see a link to the application, and from there, you will be able to get additional information. If you have questions, also on the website, you will see who you will be able to contact for additional information. If you're still looking to get involved or not quite sure what all we do or how you can be, you will see now a list of our respective committees. This particular series is co-hosted by the Programs and Capacity Building Committee along with the Membership Committee. We're happy to have you join us for one or any of all of the above. It is possible to do more than one. If you're not quite sure, again, contact us. We can help direct you. You will be introduced shortly to our panel, Akira Barclay, who is the founder of Fresh Philanthropy, and Kelly Brown, the founder and CEO of Viewpoint Consulting. Again, thank you and welcome to those who are joining us. I'm now going to excuse me, to actually give the mic to our co-chair, Diane, who will now lead you through the rest of the day.
Thank you, Monica. Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Konopke, very proud member of the CWIP board, along with Monica and several others on the call today. So I'm going to give you a recap of part 1. But actually, Shelby, if we could go back to the last slide, I'd love to just talk a little bit more about Akira and Kelly first. So this is who we're going to hear from today. And as Monica mentioned, Akira is the founder of Fresh Philanthropy. She is a seasoned consultant and social entrepreneur with 25 years of experience in grant making, fundraising, strategic partnerships, media, and marketing. As the founder of Fresh Philanthropy, she has a track record of impactful leadership, expanding and reorienting conventional thinking about philanthropy. If you were in part 1, you know that is very true. That is why we are here. All right, Akira champions the power of giving circles and everyday donors. Her expertise includes managing capacity building grants, raising significant funds for youth-serving organizations across New York City, and her role in the AT&T Imagine Your STEM Future project at Girl Scouts of the USA, which garnered recognition from the White House Council on Women and Girls for its innovative partnership development. Definitely another win in the Chicago column that over New York that we have Akira in our city now. All right, and so then I want to introduce Kelly Brown. Kelly is the founder and principal consultant at Viewpoint Consulting, which provides support to philanthropic organizations and individuals investing resources to strengthen underserved communities. Kelly has over 25 years of experience in the field, offering data-driven strategic consulting, facilitation, and training to increase impact and equity within foundations and social sector organizations. She has held leadership roles at TransAfrica, the Vanguard Public Foundation, the Marguerite Casey Foundation, and the D5 Coalition, an initiative to strengthen philanthropy, through a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her work researching and advocating for the critical importance of demographic data has made her a leader in the field. So as you can tell, we are going to really nerd out on the data and on what is there and what is not there today with these two amazing leaders. So just before we get in the conversation with Akira and Kelly, I want to give you a brief recap of part one for those of you who were there and weren't there, a reminder or a recap for you. There was a lot, and we will share a recording. So this is just going to be a very short, short piece. But three big things that came out were defining philanthropy, talking about collective giving, and talking about power as it relates to what we are working on. So defining philanthropy, Akira shared the most inclusive definition of philanthropy as the love of humankind and the love of what it means to be human. She spoke about how in the US, philanthropy is also and typically defined by wealth. When we talk about fundraising and grant making, the common definition we work with no longer focuses on the humanity. It tends to focus more on the dollars and cents. When we use the definition based on wealth, that excludes anyone who doesn't have it in great quantities. We get a field where high net worth donors become who we think of as philanthropists, and the way they practice philanthropy becomes our default model for how we think of philanthropy as a whole, even though the large majority of philanthropists don't fit that profile. So enter collective giving. So collective giving is an opportunity for philanthropists to pool their resources. And those resources include time, money, influence, access, all sorts of sources of wealth. And change the thinking of philanthropy as being done by individuals to something being done by a collective or a community. By and large, these are the ways, collective giving, are the ways women and people of color engage in philanthropy. Models include giving circles, mutual aid societies, participatory grant making, and more. They leverage those different kinds of wealth that a community holds. Not only are these examples of collective giving, they're also typically or most commonly examples of trust-based philanthropy, which covers a lot of different types of giving, and we're going to talk more about that today. But they're also not new in any real sense. They are as old as giving is. They just don't have as much light shined on them as others. So then third, power. Because ultimate decision makers, the board members of nonprofits and philanthropies largely come from the corporate sector, they're often using ROI measurements that fall short of measuring both philanthropic and social impact well. We know this. So we need to disrupt these definitions and narrow ways of measuring in order to break up the cycles of philanthropy that are being seen inaccurately as really only the purview of wealthy individuals versus capturing the full scope of philanthropy and philanthropists. So that's where we're going to pick up the conversation today. And just so you all know the landscape of what we're going to do today, we're going to talk with Kelly and Akira for probably 25 minutes or so. Then we're going to do about 10 minutes of small group discussion. We'll put you in some breakouts, low stress, just, just a conversation, get to meet a few people. Then we'll come back for Q&A and wrap up. So Kelly, I'm going to start with you. Very big question. So take whatever part of it you want, but what do we know and not know about who gives and how they give?
Yeah, thanks so much to CWIP for the invitation, the opportunity to speak to folks, and thanks for everyone who joined us this morning for this conversation. As some of you may know, this has been consuming me for much of my career in philanthropy. Is really how do we get a better sense of what's out there with better and sound data, and I have learned that it's often a surprise to people how little we know. How little good data we know. There's lots of data out there, but very little of it is good, sound, and reliable. And unfortunately, many of the claims that are made around the social sector, around philanthropy, around who's giving what is based on very, very poor data, which is It's not even data that is where it's as they often kind of say, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's not even good, and because it's so fragmented, it's and limiting, and as a result, through much of my work, as you mentioned, sort of trying to build better, more effective philanthropic efforts across the board, you really need good data to know what you're doing, and and so a lot of my work has been, especially in recent years, is helping to build the processes, the systems, and I think most importantly, the will to get better, to get better data. So I think where we're at now is that the largest data sets on the social sector are often drawn, they kind of start at the 990, right? Because it's a tax form, first of all. It's not annual report, it's not anything else, it's just a tax form. Because it's required. It's required by the federal government that all nonprofit entities, social sector entities, have to fill out some version of this form. So that's kind of what you say, the population data. But those forms, again, they're tax forms. They don't have lots of other data that people want to know about association. So there's been a lot of work to try and flesh that out, but that's where people start. People are probably also familiar with what the entity now known as Candid, which is the amalgamation of what was formerly the Foundation Center and formerly GuideStar. 5 years ago, they merged into one thing, and were reborn as Candid to try and operate as the largest data aggregator on the social sector that is also grounded in the 990, but goes beyond. It fleshes out outcomes, it fleshes out leadership, it fleshes out impact. But having worked with Candid, I often kind of say I know Candid before it was Candid, but because I worked with both GuideStar and Foundation Center, it's more than a notion, is to try and get good, sound data that is reliable and consistent, particularly on giving, who's giving, information about givers, foundations, everything from individuals to foundations, as well as who's getting resources. The other challenge too is that these entities are still, because people want data, are still bombarded with requests for data. The problem is that data goes into these little piles of whether they're foundations, whether they're government agencies, whether they're funders. So nonprofits are besieged with requests for data, and yet it's not actually rolling up into anything that's meaningful and usable for the field as a whole. So that's really where we're focusing a lot of our work, and trying to shift the conversation to not just what consumers of the data need, but also what providers of the data need. So because we'll get more data if I'm giving you data that I'm going to benefit from. I will prioritize giving data if I think I'm going to benefit from the collective aggregation of this. So a lot of the work that we've been focusing on, particularly with demographics, but not only, is to really strengthen and support and encourage nonprofits to see the value of sharing data that is meaningful and useful to them, and getting funders, foundations of all types, from individuals, whether they're giving circles, all the way up to the Fords and Hewletts of the world, to align in a way of strengthening the data ecosystem, so that we know what we're doing, we have a better understanding of what we're doing, and everybody has access to use it to strengthen their programs.
Thank you. So, Akira, bringing you in here, what is counted? Like, give us some specifics of, what do we know and what do we don't not know? If you and that we don't have, days to come, but just some of those highlights of some of the most acute things that's like, yeah, we know a lot about this, but we really don't know anything about this.
And I'm so glad that we have Kelly Brown here, who I
Yeah.
have to say, in 2012, when I was a graduate student, it was her work that I really had to lean on for pretty much everything that I was doing at the time. So I definitely want to publicly thank Kelly for her work, and
And we're still at it now 8 years
I'm
later.
so glad that she's still at it. But to answer your question, what we have oftentimes is, sort of the bare bones, the information that comes from those tax forms. We have the total amounts that are given overall throughout the country, we have those total amounts broken up into categories, particularly how much of that is given to religious institutions or churches, how much is given to education, how much is given to, but these subjects oftentimes, especially if you do work in the nonprofit sector, you know that they, one of the things that makes them not reliable, as Kelly mentioned, is that oftentimes these issues intersect. So we don't often have organizations that only work on one of those issues. So how those buckets are categorized in the how they are determined to be in each category is not something that is standardized. We always get the sensational headlines every year. Who gave the most? Like it's a race. And so, that goes to the focus on, these top 5 people each year. We also get measures of how much a nonprofit organization spends in their budget on each function. So if you are charged with developing budgets for, let's say, to go along with your grant proposal, you have your annual budget, you have your program budget, you have these breakdowns that often seem very arbitrary, but nonprofit organizations are often asked to present data in percentages of how the money is being used for what purpose within each organization. So we have kind of lots of random buckets of information that is being gathered and reported. And oftentimes they're being reported with the caveat that it doesn't give a complete or clear picture. So we're measuring some things, but we're not measuring a lot that matters.
Yeah. And then what about the stuff that's not even getting tracked? So, like, and so much of that is, again, back to how women and people of color give, mutual aid, doing things in their communities. No one's ever writing some of that down. That is getting in the way of the impact, if I may editorialize, in this direct giving, especially. So what are each of you, Akira, Kelly, thinking about that? Do we need to capture that? Do we estimate that in some way? How are we thinking about all of this that is really outside of the 990 and outside of, the donate button, on a website? How do we think about all of that? Because we know it's huge.
I want to share a quote from a study from the Generosity Commission. It's called Everyday Actions, Extraordinary Potential, the Power of Giving and Volunteering. And this was released about a week ago. It says, we need to know more about the contributions of mutual aid networks and giving circles, as well as the whole spectrum of giving behaviors outside of monetary donations to nonprofit organizations embraced by everyday givers and volunteers to gain a fuller understanding of the broad ecosystem of generosity. What that gets to the heart of is that, Diane, I think I neglected to specify this part. What is being measured and what we have is what happens inside of a nonprofit organization and what they're able to capture. And what we often don't think about is so much of the work of philanthropy and generosity happens outside of that structure. That is what is not being recorded.
Should it be?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and I guess what I would also add to that is that, that's a beautiful quote and a really important sentiment. And I think it is still a reflection of, what I call sort of the fetish of numbers in our culture and in our society, and the fetish of sort of an organizational structure, which is it's almost privileging the things that can be counted, where it's just like, well, we know there's lots of stuff that can't be counted, but it's not that important. The important stuff is what can be counted. And I often tell the story of Freedom Summer of 1964, which I think most people, even who were not born at that time, are aware of, which goes, was the Freedom Summer, where people from all over the country, and particularly the North, went to the South to register people to vote. And it was, and the goal was to register as many people to vote. And they ended up with sort of, I think, 17,000 voter applications submitted, 1,600 were accepted. So one could kind of say that was a kind of a failure. Probably they didn't do so hot. But as we know, Freedom Summer had Freedom Libraries, Freedom Schools, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the immeasurable leadership development, people getting in touch with communities, people sleeping on their porches, people getting killed, people getting bombed, people getting then all of that was part of why the Freedom Summer was one of the most consequential movements in history, easily. And yet, if we had only sort of looked at numbers, we would have gotten this tiny, tiny, least important at the time measure of what was the impact of that program. And I think that we have to sort of reframe this thing that not the most important things to understand are not the most, not always things that can be counted. And I think it sort of relates to, one of the other questions that came up in the last session, and we want to talk about this, which is the whole idea of trust-based philanthropy. And so even though that has become kind of a term, and it has some principles and some practices, in a real sense, we've always had trust-based philanthropy because people trust who they're with. I trust my alma mater. I trust my hospital and my doctor. I trust my arts organization where I go every Sunday with my friends, and that's who I give to because that's my milieu. And I don't ask them always for numbers or data or what have you. I may overlook mistakes. I may understand the complexity because I'm in a set of relationships and experiences I trust and that I invest in. Same thing is going on with giving circles and other forms of giving. That's what makes them powerful. And I think that's what makes them most powerful, not because they can't be measured. It's because there's something about what they're doing that can't be measured that is making it work. I looked at Akira's comment from the last session where we shouldn't, she cautioned against trying to quantify things that can't be quantified, or trying to see these things as stepping stones to more formal, measurable kinds of philanthropy, when that is really, that's one way of doing it, but it may not always be the best way. So I think folks need to really sort of have to build the muscle to stand firm in presenting an equally cogent and as equally legitimate understanding of impact than what our culture fetishizes now or prioritizes.
Mhm.
And that's really a trust in a value position because as Kelly said, it's privileging the data that is easy to track and quantify in numbers. And it's saying that anything that can't be put into that format is less important. And I mean, not only is that not true, that means you're also not really doing as thorough of an evaluation of impact. Like if you don't know, you don't have a sense or an accounting of everything that goes on and all of the results, then and you're only measuring one narrow piece of it. Kelly's example was very illuminating. Like how much of this are you missing?
Mhm.
The particularly when you start talking about uh direct services with humans, with people. This
Totally.
isn't, some of it is going to be you're going to need to make space for someone to tell a story.
Mhm.
And you're going to have to find a way to understand that there is also rigor in that. So much you can learn about the impact or the effectiveness of a program when you listen to someone, a human person's experience with it. How were they changed? It may not be a pre and post survey necessarily that you will then put into Excel and make a bar graph from, but you will hear out of the 50 participants, 40 of them were effusive about the life-changing impact that that program had. So you've
And I
got to
would
be able to take both.
And I would also just add to just reinforce that, Akira, is that I think sometimes the reliance on those numbers happens because there's an absence of trust, right? There's an absence of relationship. And so as I mentioned, when people are very used to giving to their neighbors, giving to, they're not asking for, well, I'm not giving you any, money for your Girl Scout unless you tell me how many boxes of cookies. So they're part of my, my community. And that because I have a trusting relationship with them. And if we don't have, because so much of formal philanthropy, there's this huge social economic distance between the giver and the receiver, that there needs that the numbers and the numerical evaluation becomes the way in which I make a connection. And so all of the other stuff that's most important and that's super valuable, that everyone understands, that wherever you are in society, you understand the value of those relationships and the intangibility of things that are important, that you still invest in, even though you can't count them, is something that I think we have to kind of put our finger on, and as you're doing, Akira, lift up and not always compare it with numbers. It's not, there are some things that they're just not comparable, but it doesn't mean they're not important.
That gets to the heart of the trust-based philanthropy, Diane.
Go
That
ahead.
that power dynamic. Did you want to ask
It-
something else?
Well, no,
But
I think
that's the next piece, is the tension between this. We
Yes,
want
it's
we
the
want all
power.
the data. We want the impact data. We want the, ROI, quote unquote, data. And we want to trust that we don't need to count every single thing. As I'm listening to you all, I was just having this sort of at the most basic level. Okay, if I give you a cup of sugar, I don't need to see the cake, right? Like, I believe you're going to do what you said you're going to do with it. And yet, across the neighborhood, there are hundreds of cups of sugar, and I would love to know how many people are helping make cakes, right? So it's like, what, and that's a little trite, but it's just like, this is what we're talking about. So how do we pick what to prioritize that isn't being measured but should be? And then how do we let trust be the rest of it? Like, can you talk to those tensions and maybe give some folks some tangible ways to think about what should we push to measure in numbers and what should we not, or isn't as high of a priority? Because if everything's a priority, nothing is, and yada yada. So where do we go with those tensions?
I want to speak to the relationship first
Great.
between donors and nonprofit organizations, because the trust-based aspect is really about people. Donors often approach nonprofit organizations with a level of skepticism that comes from lack of trust in leaders, but also um, a lack of knowledge of the work of the organization, which they really can't be blamed for. That's a matter of education. So there's a lot going on in that power dynamic between donors and nonprofit organizations. Now, whether you think there's something for you to learn about the work of the nonprofit organization is something else, because we don't see that often. We don't see donors who don't know anything about the work say, this is very interesting to me as a donor. I would love to understand what's the priority here? How does this work? And how can I best support you as the donor? So going from I am a board member, I am a donor, I got the money, so that means the priority for what I want comes first. Trust-based philanthropy allows for a better and more functional way for donors and nonprofit organizations to work together. So we're not ascribing intelligence or ability to someone because they have money. We're working together to see how we can have that money allied with the work that's being done and how that works best. So that's the part, and I'll throw to Kelly to talk about maybe what we should be measuring more.
Yeah, that's a really great framing. And as you were talking, Diane, it makes me think about again where almost 100% of my focus now, which is on getting demographic data, which is data that I would argue does need to be collected and does need to be assessed and does need to be understood. And a lot of the work that we're doing is kind of creating the facilitating the will and the mechanisms and the process to do that effectively. It's extremely, it's very complex, but it's very essential. The one thing that I will say about that though is that even in the process of doing this and working with primarily foundations, less so individuals, but primarily foundations around building their systems and their relationship to this kind of data, it also sort of takes on similar contours around the rigidity of numbers, so that so I'm constantly having to remind people that getting demographic data, asking these questions, that do you identify as black, white, male, female, what have you, is the first step. It's the first step that opens up a lot of other questions about how do we use this data to understand what we're doing. And what I have found is that people spend a lot of time on the how of to ask these questions, and then to looking at sort of very simplistic sort of threshold assessments of what the numbers that these questions produce, which tell them very, very often very, very little about how to use this data. And so what I often say is, again, working with foundations, is a lot of foundations who are sort of coming to this conversation now and this data, they want data that says something about their grant making rather than something to their grant making. I see Monica waving her hand. I'm not sure what that means, but which are two different things. So when you get this data, kind of say, this is a picture of my grant making, rather than I'm getting information that I need to inform how I be strategic, how I invest, how I understand, how I assess. I argue for this data for the latter, but there's still a lot of energy around the former, because this this data is being used to tell stories that are not always quite accurate, because the nature of the data is as I started out, so fragmented and limited and problematic. So to your question, Diane, I think those strengthening the capacity to just understand who we are as a sector, who's leading organizations, who's operating in organizations, who's benefiting from organizations, who's influencing organizations, because who we are matters. It doesn't often say it's not the only thing that matters. It's not always the most important thing. It matters in ways that are complicated ways with other things that matter, but it's not irrelevant. And that is information and data that the sector really needs to have to do its job effectively, both from a leadership perspective, from a management perspective, and from an impact perspective. So that's part of the reason why I'm leaning into that so much, is because this is data that the whole world uses. Every other sector gets demographic data. They don't even talk about it. We just know it matters. But the social sector, I would argue, is very far behind in being rigorous about getting that kind of essential data.
And what are some of we can ask it either way, but what are some of the reasons for that? I mean, resources, of course, comes to mind, but are there other barriers to getting people and organizations to share data, and what can we do about those barriers?
Well, I think I'm sure Akira has a point. I think so. It's the sharing the data and to what kind of data is slightly different. Part of the thing too is, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that nonprofits are inundated with requests for all kinds of data, and that's overwhelming. I mean, it's really in my sense, it's really malpractice to burden some nonprofits with so much requests for different kinds of data to not have any sort of coordinated effect around that. With respect to demographic data, that is more complicated, is because getting this data requires people to explicitly engage identity. And then that is very, very difficult for some organizations. You have to explicitly engage it just to get answers to those questions, how you ask them, how you have to explicitly engage it in your organizations, and many organizations are not inclined or equipped or prepared to do that. Let me clarify. Many are not inclined or prepared. Many are inclined, but don't feel like they have the competency, so they're very nervous and scared. And that's a barrier to getting the data, which is why a lot of our work is trying to help strengthen those competencies and lower the barriers. But those are the two reasons. And one, there's just so much request for so many different kinds, it's overwhelming. And two, some of the data, particularly of the data that engages identity, is fraught, and it's hard to engage.
And then there is the issue of competency, as Kelly spoke of, but then you also have to talk about how accessible is data collection. In nonprofit organizations, program design is essential. So you've designed your program to yield certain results. You're going to build your evaluation around measuring those results. Your funder says, my foundation is focused on this, which is just some small aspect of your program in your nonprofit organization. So the foundation demands you to translate your impact into the terms that the foundation needs. They want to report about their impact. So right there, we're only talking about one of this nonprofit's funders.
Sure.
So if you think about a nonprofit organization, let's say they have 10 foundation grants, and each of those foundations are asking them to translate the impact of their one program 10 different ways to satisfy what the foundation wants to report.
Yeah.
That is a burden. It is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And by and large, the nonprofit organizations don't have the resources to do that. They don't have researchers. They don't have anyone that is totally dedicated to evaluation and reporting. And that is why we tend to see these big, gigantic nonprofits who have huge professional staff getting the multi-million-dollar grants, and then the smaller ones who don't have that kind of personnel power
Totally.
being given pennies. So it is an issue that has far-reaching implications for the sector as a whole.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're going to go into breakouts here in just a second, but I want to see if I can sort of make sense of what you all have been saying, because there's so much here. But just in this piece around what are some of these limiting factors. So we can start with resources, period, but then it's also the fragmentation of those resources being pulled in so many directions. And then it's competency about how to ask these questions and get this data, but then also really kind of trust in two ways, both trust of the people being asked that they are willing to share the data, but also trust from the funder or donor that the practice of whatever the nonprofit impact is that they're driving, the profession and practice of those folks is its own science, is its own art. And that's something that's in here, which we often don't acknowledge, that, just as there is a practice of being a financial analyst. There is a practice of being an XYZ program delivery manager. And so all of those things are in there that are addressable, but are potentially are some of our challenges. Did I miss any big ones in what you've been talking about?
I also want to add that part of that burden is we'll break our necks as an organization to provide this data that you've asked us for. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
Are you even going to read it?
Totally.
Is it your program officer just has to say, yes, I got the evaluation from the grantee, then what?
And is it real? Because if you burden me with different kinds of quests, I'm going to tell you whatever I can come up with. And that is, and then if you are going to actually use it for strategy, are you basing your strategy on data that actually isn't really reliable?
And are you going to take what confirms your existing biases and publish that and not other pieces of it? You know, so is my organization, my community, the people that I serve, are they going to be misrepresented in what the final product, you know, that you publish? This is what leaders of nonprofit organizations have to deal with. This is what staff deals with. And when you talk about women and women of color leaders, the lack of trust, these burdens, getting less funding overall. So you're all of these demands while you're dealing with the fact that you asked for 50,000 and they gave you 5.
But want the 50,000 level of impact measurement often. Yeah. All right. Well, I want to give our folks who are gathered a chance to talk about some of this for a few minutes at least. So Shelby, if we have breakouts, here are some prompts. You all take what you want, and they're in the chat as well. You're going to go in the chat for me, or in the breakout for maybe 6 or 7 minutes. But here's some ideas for some questions you could discuss. What are some limiting aspects of data that you are required to respond to, request, or give? So this is some productive venting here. Like what is the thing that is, that is limiting you in your role, which could be professional, in your community, philanthropic. Now, what's something you can do to shift away from the status quo that marginalizes or deprioritizes tracking women and people of color in their philanthropy? What's one thing you could do? And third, how can you make a move from using rigid ways of evaluating and understanding data to considering other broader ways of collecting impact information? So pick something that, sparks for your group and discuss it. Do some quick intros if you need them, and then we'll come back in 7 or 8 minutes.
I am able to share the slides to breakout, so I will share these too, but I did drop them in the chat if anyone wants to take a quick look. Like Diane said, we're going to go in to breakouts for about 6 minutes. We're going to do a 60-second countdown. So when you see that countdown, don't come back to the main room. You will automatically be brought back in. Just to stay in there to make sure you get all of your discussion. And I'm going to send everyone out now.
Thanks, Shelby. Welcome back. Thank you. I hope y'all had good, quick conversations. I guarantee that was not enough time. So you can, you are seen in that plight that was not enough time. But I want to we have about 6 minutes left together. So I want to see if folks either have burning questions, whether they came up, through that conversation or not. Or really big ahas or things that you think would benefit the room here to share. So you can put them in the chat, or you can just come off mute. You can use the raise hand button, whatever works for you all. And that goes for you, Akira and Kelly, of course. If there's something that you want to, hit on, feel free. Monica.
I want to share, Vivian didn't get a chance to really share everything that she wanted to share, but I did want to share that in our breakout group, we have Vivian, who's doing the grant writing and feeling the impact of these evaluation requests. So in real life, you know, like this is just hearing her experience was very enlightening, and it sort of confirms what that burden is and how it shifts and impacts the way that she has to do her work. Also, I want to emphasize that you don't always have to be in a role that is typical or expected. Part of, you know, disrupting or shifting the status quo is that anybody can speak up. We can all speak up, particularly in spaces. So Sherry is one of those people who has a role in her organization where she is facing the community in a way that people don't experience in other parts of her organization. So there's value in being able to bring her voice into the space that, you know, maybe someone else will never have that experience. So that's, I want to, just to drive home the two things, all of this impacts the way that we do our work, and you don't have to wait for anybody to ask you to say anything. Just
Yes.
go for it.
Kelly.
And Diane, I just want to throw a couple of things in there too, is that we think that change happens from data and knowledge and intellect, and change happens from relationships and experience, and everyone has those. Everyone, I was talking to the person in my chat, it was just me and her, and she was describing how excited she was about this gift she was getting ready to give. I said, how would you capture that? You can't. I said, but now you've infected me from our relationship and the experience of that is what has to be invested in, is giving people the opportunity to have relationships and experiences that change them. And then I guess I would also say, you know, I have this poster that you know, that says the best things in life aren't things, right? So we have to kind of have that framework to remember what we're doing transcends what we can touch and count. And we have to be advocates for leaning into to valuing that.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Anyone with one more last thing? Or should we wrap? So many good things in there. All right. Akira, will you plug this event coming up as we did last time?
Gladly.
Please.
This is What is Your Power, hosted by the city-based Giving Circles and Councils at Chicago Foundation for Women. We invite you to join us on October 17th. We can continue this conversation. You can find out also how each of these groups engages to really support women, girls, non-binary persons across the city. And you'll have an opportunity to join if you want to, learn how you can get involved and engaged otherwise. So please click the link and register and join us. And there's going to be catering. The food is going to be good. I'm on the host committee.
That's key. All right, Monica, will you bring us home?
Certainly. Actually, I was going to say what I was sharing in the chat. In the event we ran out of time, that next week you will receive an email that will contain not only a link to the recording of the two-part series, but also resources. And we will certainly appreciate your response to the survey. Any questions that you have, feel free to reach out to info@cwiponline.org. And I had to stop myself from saying com.org. And I've also included my own personal email address if there's anything I could do to help anyone, because I'm also on the membership committee. So if you have questions about CWIP at large, you're thinking about joining a membership, happy to make introductions to you to others.
Well, thank you all so much. Oh, were you done, Monica? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and again, thank you for everyone for joining us today.
Perfect. We are on the same page. Yes, thank you, Akira, Kelly, everyone who made this possible. This conversation absolutely continues, and we look forward to all of you being part of it. Thank you so much. Have a good Friday.
And we would like to ask the panelists and the organizers to stay on for just a minute, please.
Sure, absolutely.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.